Chapter 3, which we didn't actually talk much about in class, and is one of the, like Chapter 1, one of the hardest chapters in the book. If Chapter 2 focuses on modern linguistics' attempt to keep writing exterior to a theory of language, and Derrida's analysis of the theoretical and philosophical and ontological consequences of that move, Chapter 3 focuses on various attempts throughout the same history he outlines in Chapter 1 to formulate the very thing he's prefiguring in this book, a grammatology, a science, or in some cases a history of writing. Some philosophers, Derrida tells us in this chapter, like Descartes, like Leibniz, saw in writing, in script itself, the possibility of a universal language. Not one that was spoken, not one that we could converse with each other in, but one that was rigorously akin to Chinese ideograms, or what was understood then to be, the Chinese writing. Of course, linguistics has developed a great deal since then, as it's actually learned the language and whatnot. But anyway, this sort of what was seen as a non-phonetic script might, they hoped, form a detour around the problem of pronunciation. That is, the phonetic linking between writing and speech. Its purpose would be nothing but a pure mimetic fusion of image and word that would directly reference things in the world. No matter our native language, we would at least be able to communicate with others through this script of word images. We all see the same things in the world, after all. Do we? Derrida's intervention here is not unlike his challenge to Saussurian linguistics, that these efforts to develop a pure writing, or this hope for a pure writing, akin to something like mathematical script in the theoretical sciences, makes the same assumptions about writing that is already in Plato, and that is also in Saussure. That writing is separate from, derivative of, and exterior to spoken or natural language. This pure writing, this cipher, as it were, would merely be supplemental and intermediate between languages that could exist on their own. More than this, Derrida argues that this logocentric approach to the project of pure writing is also ethnocentric. The Chinese, the Egyptians, the cultures caught between a culture without writing, the kind, as it were, that Claude Lévi-Strauss takes up in the work that Derrida analyzes in the first chapter of Part 2, or the chapter I keep calling Chapter 4, and a culture with phonetic writing. Right? That this identification of the Chinese, of the Egyptians, on some sort of like line between cultures without writing all the way up to Western civilized phonetic languages is a powerful ethnocentrism. The dream of pure non-phonetic cipher writing is also, Derrida claims, and pause mid-sentence to turn to page 80, you can turn there if you'd like, is also, drum roll, a sort of European hallucination, right? So let's read that full sentence at the top of 80. The concept of Chinese writing, in the way I was just talking about it, as some sort of mediate relationship between non-phonetic and phonetic writing, and also as the inspiration for this hope of a pure and universal language. This concept of Chinese writing thus functioned as a sort of European hallucination. This implied nothing fortuitous. This functioning obeyed a rigorous necessity. And the hallucination translated less an ignorance than a misunderstanding. It was not disturbed by the knowledge of Chinese script, limited but real, which was then available. In the following sections of this difficult chapter, Derrida argues that while historians or philosophers gave up this dream of a pure and perfect cipher language, that subsequent histories of writing have... Sorry about that. Let me start over. In the following sections of this chapter, Derrida argues that while historians and philosophers gave up the dream of a pure and perfect cipher language, that subsequent histories of writing have identical problematic tropes, from the pictogram to the ideogram to the letter, etc. More than these histories and the continuity that they share with Saussurian science carry on the positions of metaphysics, right? And you can get a huge list of these on page 82, right? What are these tropes? What are these positions? What are these presumptions about the relationship between writing and speech that histories of writing sort of carry with them and as the most basic presuppositions and ground of the histories that they're writing? The deconstruction or the desedimentation of this whole story of writing requires, Derrida claims, a reunifying of, or rather maybe the complex sort of cleaving of the complicity between those things that these fields presume to be separate. So what are these things that these fields presume to be separate in some sort of hierarchy that Derrida wants to rearrange and rethink as complicit and folded into each other from the start? So if you turn to page 85, is that the right page? Actually, yeah, it is. Sorry about that. That took forever. You just watched me sit here looking at different pages. Okay. All right, so top of 85. The sentence begins, "From one discourse to another, the difference lies only in the mode of inhabiting the interior of a conceptuality destined or already submitted to decay. Within the conceptuality or already without it, we must understand, we, here, now, must attempt to recapture the unity of gesture and speech, of body and language, of tool and thought, before the originality of the one and the other is articulated, and without letting this profound unity, this complicit origin of the two, of gesture and speech, body and language, tool and thought, writing and speech, without letting the profound unity of these things give rise to Confucianism. These original significations must not be confused within the orbit of the system where they are opposed, but to think the history of the system, which is what Derrida, in a way, is attempting to do here or to prefigure in this book. Its meaning and its value must, in an exorbitant way, be somewhere exceeded." Okay. So we see here Derrida is saying, by using this word exorbitant, is already anticipating that closing section of chapter 2 of part 2, that dangerous supplement, that section that's titled The Exorbitant, right, on method. Okay, if you skip to the bottom of the page then, bottom of the page, we see Derrida also beginning to problematize the idea of the line itself, right? That not only the idea of the terms as already being split within the metaphysics that the sciences and histories of writing have inherited and forgot and have neglected to notice that they've inherited, but also the very model or the structure of the line or linearization or teleology from being a culture without writing to being a culture with ideographic or pictographic writing to a culture with phonetic writing. Derrida says near the bottom of 85, you can see it on the right side of the page, the word history has no doubt always been associated with a linear scheme, right? We think of in elementary school when we had to draw timelines, right? Has been associated with a linear scheme of the unfolding of presence, where the line relates the final presence to the originary presence, according to the straight line or the circle. For the same reason, the pluridimensional symbolic structure is not given within the category of the simultaneous. Simultaneity coordinates two absolute presents, 2 points or instants of presence, and it remains a linearist concept. The concept of linearization is much more effective, faithful, and intrinsic than those that are habitually used for classifying scripts and describing their history, pictogram, ideogram, letter, etc. Turn the page, exposing more than one prejudice, particularly about the relationship between ideogram and pictogram, about so-called graphic realism. Leroy-Gourhan, one of the scholars he's writing about, recalls the unity within the mythogram of all the elements of which linear writing marks the disruption: technics, particular graphics, art, religion, economy. To recover the access to this unity, right? The fact that from the very beginning with writing, or units of writing, whether they be mythograms or ideograms or pictograms or phonograms, as it were, right, to access the unity or the synthetic origin of all that's folded into that, to this structure, other structure of unity, we must desediment, quote, 4,000 years of linear writing. So what's going on with all that, right? So I just read a bunch of stuff and it might have been a bit confusing, right? Think back to chapter 1 for a second, and the scientific fields that we're uncovering what Derrida calls an arca writing, right? So think of programming, think of the genetics, think of quantum physics even. And then let's read 87, right? So I hate to do this. Read a passage, say, I'm going to promise what it means, and then read another passage, but, you know, you guys know how I work by now. So turn to page 87. Right? Turn to page 87. Top of 87. Because we are beginning to write differently, we must reread differently. For over a century, this uneasiness has been evident in philosophy, in science, in literature. All the revolutions in these fields can be interpreted as shocks that are gradually destroying the linear model, which is to say, the epic model. What is thought today cannot be written according to the line in the book, except by imitating the operation implicit in teaching modern mathematics with an abacus. So Derrida is being kind of funny here, right? That to retain notions of the book, to retain notions of totality, to retain sort of naive notions of intention or presence or decidability or determination would be like teaching modern mathematics or calculus with an abacus. That's what Derrida is claiming here. This inadequation is not modern, but it is exposed today better than before. The access to pluridimensionality and to a delinearized temporality, so a lot of multisyllabic words here, but words that should nevertheless, I think, make some sense to us, right? This inadequation is not modern, but it is exposed today better than ever before, right? The inadequation, or we could say the inadequacy of terms like book, totality, linearization, proximity, presence, fullness, security, all these sorts of things, identity, the inadequacy of these terms for helping us understand what writing is, or what, or what existence or being is, for that matter, is not a modern problem, Derrida is saying, but it is exposed better today than ever before because of developments in science and literature and whatnot, right? The access to pluridimensionality, right? This is sort of what he means by difference. That every time in class when I do this, right? That's sort of what he means, right? The pluridimensionality of writing, of traces, of fabrics, of meaning, of identity, of origins, right? This access to that and to a delinearized temporality is not a simple regression toward the mythogram. On the contrary, it makes all the rationality subjected to the linear model appear as another form and another age of mythography. The meta-rationality, or the meta-scientificity, that is the attempt to step outside and look upon rationality, what's the logic of reason, or the attempt to step outside of science and say what's the scientificity of science, which are thus announced within the meditation, the meditation upon writing, can therefore be no more shut up within a science of man than conform to the traditional idea of science. In one and the same gesture, they leave man, science, and the line behind. So Derrida is attempting to articulate and be explicit about what he needs to leave behind in order to continue developing this philosophy of writing and difference. So that was a lot. What Derrida is thus after is a way to theorize the complicity of origins, right? And by complicity, again, think of all the times I'm like trying to twist my fingers into various knots, right? The complicity of origins as just as, writing in the narrow sense um, um, is sort of always already there from the start in Saussure's linguistics. Writing is always already complicit in any language. It is a condition of any language. It is already there. You might say, in the beginning, one builds a beginning from traces. Thus one defers any sense of the beginning, any ability to capture the full presence of a beginning. One twists together beginnings, creates the myth of a beginning. I want to read a little bit more. We're almost done, trust me. Let's think about these pages, right? So I'm pausing here and moving on to another topic. So bottom of 92. Derrida says, or writes rather, the fact that access to the written sign assures the sacred power of keeping existence operative within the trace, and of knowing the general structure of the universe. That all clergies exercising political power or not were constituted at the same time as writing, and by the disposition of graphic power that strategy, ballistics, diplomacy, agriculture, fiscality, and penal law are linked in their history and in their structure to the constitution of writing. That the origin assigned to writing had been, according to the chains and mythemes, always analogous in the most diverse cultures, and that it communicated in a complex but regulated manner with the distribution of political power, as with familial structure. If we keep in mind that the possibility of capitalization and of politico-administrative organization had always passed through the hands of scribes who laid down the terms of many wars and whose function was always irreducible, whoever the contending parties might be. That through discrepancies, inequalities of development, the play of permanencies, of delays, of diffusions, etc., the solidarity among ideological, religious, scientific, technical systems and the systems of writing, which were therefore more and other than means of communication or vehicles of the signified, remains indestructible. That the very sense of power and effectiveness in general, which could appear as such as meaning and mastery by idealization, only with so-called symbolic power, was always linked with the disposition of writing. That economy, monetary or pro-monetary, and graphic calculation were co-originary. That there could be no law without the possibility of trace. All this refers to a common and radical possibility that no determined science, no abstract discipline, can think as such. So Derrida is drawing our attention to, for a moment, a history of power, right? A history of power of those who, not all of them malicious, were able nevertheless to construct for themselves the full presence of power, when really all that they had at their disposal was the symbolic, was, in other words, traces, signifiers, out of which they built up, right, economies, armies, wars, scriptures, interpretations, ideologies, so on and so forth, right, out of which they built up and energized in more democratic ages their constituents and their voting bases, right? That those who are able to do this are those who can wield, manage, and use the written, use not just the written word, but the writing, graphics, right? Inscription. It wouldn't be hard to come up with contemporary analogies here. But I want to end by thinking about thinking, right? What does Derrida mean? That these fields, right, can't think as such. What does Derrida mean, this impossibility of thinking at the end of that passage? If by thought one means a free activity of critically apprehending the world as it is, without prejudice, bias, roots, preconceptions, frameworks, beliefs, dogmas, tones, polemics, then yes, to think, writing within logocentrism, within presence, is impossible. Thus, a grammatology is impossible. The logos cannot master the gram. It can't do so. It's never been able to do so ethically, politically, morally, philosophically, historically, scientifically, or otherwise. Or ontologically or existentially, even. And as we're coming to find out, biologically either. I think Derrida is also saying something else about thought near the end of this chapter. Right? So look at the very end of the chapter. There's a sentence, and I want to begin in the middle of a sentence where the word thought is italicized in the middle of one of the last paragraphs here. Thought is for me a perfectly neutral name, the blank part of the text, the necessarily indeterminate index of a future epoch of difference. In a certain sense, thought means nothing. Like all openings, this index belongs within a past epoch by the face that is open to view. This thought has no weight. It is in the play of the system, that very thing which never has weight. Thinking is what we already know, we have not yet begun. Measured against the shape of writing, it is broached only in the episteme. Thought for Derrida is that ideal activity which we are never quite doing. The best we can do, caught within the closure of our moment, is to play in the prefigurations of thought. The blank spaces, the traces, the difference, the complicit unfolding of various beginnings, here and now. In some sense, this might explain why so many people who love to read literature, who also love to write literature, often find themselves falling in love with Derrida. Why not philosophers? Why not more scientists? Why people who love literature? Not all people who love literature, certainly not, but why people who love literature? Because there are a bunch of blank spots when studying literature. And when you go into that field, you're sort of okay with it. That each novel, each poem presents a problem and presents itself almost as a playground for our reading. Not to do with it what we want, but to maybe learn to love it and to honor its singularity in some way. Right? Through techniques of interpretation, through techniques of reading, by thinking with it, and by translating it with and against other texts that we've encountered. Anyway, this ending to chapter 3 offers an interesting reading task to us. Speaking of reading, right? Speaking of a blank spot. What do we make of this modesty, right? Where Derrida says we have not really quite yet begun to think. He's not the first one to ever say this, but I won't trace that genealogy for you just yet. What do we make of his modesty? Because in some sense he's claiming he hasn't begun to think either. In such an audacious book, it's hard for some people, I imagine, not to read it as a false insistence, or the false insistence of a charlatan, right? This is, in some sense, Noam Chomsky's problem with Derrida. We might also think about it as one who gives away that he doesn't quite know what he's talking about, as I think some of you suspect. We might also read it as a moment of honesty, a mode of reading, as it were, that seeks to occasion for others what it itself cannot yet master, right? Of merely broaching or opening a possibility that cannot quite actualize right now because the conditions just aren't quite right. So, all right, anyway, so I'll leave you with that mystery of what Derrida means about thinking at the end of chapter 3, and simply say that chapter 3 is his attempt to look at the other side of the coin. Chapter 2, he looked at a particularly important figure who attempted to exteriorize writing from his work. In chapter 3, he attempts to look at those who tried to make writing an interior either of a science or of a history, and the sort of pitfalls they ran into, since they brought with them the assumptions about writing that pretty much dominated those who were attempting to exteriorize it in the first place. So Derrida ends by saying that in an effort, if one wanted to write a history or a science or a philosophy of writing, one has to kind of give up all of that and become exorbitant, try to get outside the orbit of those preconceptions. And the genius with which he does it is by not abandoning those ideas, but by literalizing and radicalizing them. Okay. All right. Well, I hope that was somewhat useful, and I'll be putting up more videos soon that looks at the chapters from part 2, nature, culture, writing.